welcome to Module 5. Here we're actually going to be starting the brewing process. We're going to see kind of how all the parts that we've learned about go together, and Stacy's going to walk us through that.
Excellent. Thanks, Brandon. So we already talked about our ingredients, which is our cereal grains or our barley grains. This particular recipe is a English dark ale. It doesn't look very dark here, but you can see that there are some dark grains in here. We're going to add these grains to our mash tun. In this case, it's a igloo cooler with a manifold in it. We're going to take our 190-degree water. We're going to add it to these room temperature grains, and we want to mash those grains at 152 degrees for 60 minutes. So when we add our 190-degree water to our room temperature grains, when they offset and finally settle out to temperature, they should settle to right around 152. 152 to 156 is the optimum temperature for this particular recipe. Is what we want to mash our grains. That's going to provide a good conversion of sugar and extract all the sugars from the grains without adding any tannins or any off flavors. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take our 190-degree water, we're going to put it in our cooler. We want to make sure that we don't lose a lot of temperature by just adding them both at the same time. So we're going to let the water sit in our cooler for about 5 minutes to heat up our vessel. And then after our vessel's heated for about 5 minutes, we'll add our grains, we'll stir those in, and then we'll let it sit for 60 minutes. Check our temperature every once in a while, make any adjustments if we need to. So here we go. So for this recipe, that's about 5.5 gallons of water. We're going to let that sit in there. That 5.5 gallons of water we'll be adding with some additional water to rinse our grains, which is called the sparging process. So after our grains are set in and have mashed all the way out, and we've confirmed that we have a sugar conversion, we'll start draining that first set of water off, this water off into our boil kettle. And we'll actually use two different sparging processes for this particular batch. It's known as batch sparging. There's two different ways to sparge your grains. There's fly sparging and batch sparging. This mash tun is actually set up to fly sparge, but I find it easier and better and shorter to do a batch sparge. With a fly sparge, you run a continuous layer of water over the top of the grains while the valve is open, allowing it to drain at a very slow rate, and eventually it just rinses all the grains out and all the sugar water, the wort, into your boil kettle. It takes a little bit longer. I've done it once and I didn't have very good efficiency with it. It came out pretty watery with a low sugar content. So I switched to a batch sparge process. And in that particular process, what we'll do is we'll rinse the grains by just pouring a specific temperature water back on top of the grains after we've drained the first runnings out. We'll pour it in, we'll stir it up, we'll let those actually rinse, we'll drain that off, and then we'll do it a second time. And then we should end up with our desired amount in our boil kettle. In this case, we want about 6.5 gallons in our boil kettle. After we boil that off, we should have about 5.5 gallons left to go into our fermenter. So we pre-measure our water to get to that point using brewing software to tell us what size batch we want, tells us how much water to use. So it's all pre-measured, and after we're all said and done, we should have about 6.5 gallons of wort in our boil kettle. We'll boil that off, add our hops at the prescribed time, and then we'll have beer. So we'll come back whenever we get to that process. All right, so we have our 190-degree water that's been in our cooler for 5 minutes now. We're going to go ahead and add our grains. We're going to enlist some help from our other master brewer here, Mr. Feder. It's real important that when we add the grains to the water, it's really hot, that we stir these in. We want to avoid getting any kind of dough balls or anything. So if you add it too fast and you don't have it stirred, you can get dough balls and you have to pick those apart and stuff. So Other than that, we're going to add the grains to our water and we should be good. See, we want to stir it. You can see some of the dark chocolate grains that are in here, the darker bits. Just making sure that we have good water contact with all of these grains. You can go a little bit faster there, Brett.
Just trying to stay away from the doo-doo balls.
Stay away from the dough balls. There's more of the darker grains that are coming in there. You said earlier, this particular recipe is an English dark ale. It's actually a clone kit from one of the local breweries here in Fort Worth that allowed the local homebrew store to market this recipe to homebrewers. So this is Rahr and Sons Winter Warmer English Dark Ale. Let's add those as well. So for this particular recipe, we have about 16 pounds of grains going in here, 16, 17 pounds of grains. It's a pretty large grain bill for a 5-gallon batch is what we hope to bottle out of this. So we should have good enough material to have a good alcohol content. Hopefully we'll have this beer when it's all said and done. Will end up being around 8 to 8.5% alcohol if we have a good conversion and fermentation from our yeast. So after we do that, we want to check our temperature. We'll set the lid on that. Just keep our temperature going. Grab the thermometer real quick. We'll check our temperature in about 5 minutes. We want to let that settle in just a little bit. So if we check our temperature right now, we know it's going to be pretty close to 190 degrees, and it hasn't really had a chance to fall into that range for the grains to absorb the water. So we'll give it about 5 minutes or so. Then we'll open this back up and see where we're at with our temperature, see if we have any hot spots, and make sure everything's mixed in properly. Looked like everything went in. We didn't have any dough balls. So once this sets for 60 minutes, then we'll start the process of drawing all this off and washing the grains, and we'll have a full kettle of wort to boil, and then we'll continue with the beer process. So we've had our grains added to our mash water. We want to make sure that we're mashing at about 152 degrees, so we're going to check our temperature at this time. They've been in here for about 10 minutes now. We'll check in a couple of different areas, make sure we don't have any hot spots or cool spots. And actually we're a little bit high. We're supposed to be at about 152 to 156. We're about 158. So I'm going to stir this a little bit, leave the lid open for just a second, and we'll see if we can get just a couple of degrees of temperature out of this. And that's really the only adjustment. If you add your mashed water temp too low, you'll actually have to add boiling water to the top of it to bring the temp up. That will cause an adjustment in your sparge water, your rinse water. So if you have that condition, or if you have that situation, you want to make sure that you subtract the amount of water you add at the mash off of your sparge. Otherwise, you'll have a different outcome whenever you end up with your wort in the boil kettle. So that should be good. We just lift the lid off for a little bit, stir these around. Still have good water contact on all the grains. We don't have any dough balls. We have good contact from top to bottom on here. So we'll check our temperature one more time. notice that I don't have any sanitation at this point with the instruments that we're putting in the mash or the boil kettle. That's because all this is still going to be boiled. So we get our sanitation from the boiling process at this point. So if there's anything that gets in, if there was any bacteria or anything on this thermometer or spoon or anything at this point, it's all going to be killed in the boiling process. So we're pretty good right here. So we're going to let this go. We're right at 156. It's a little bit on the high end, but it's not out of range for this recipe. So shut that up, and we've got another 45 minutes or so to let that go before we come back. So now that we've let our grains mash in our mash tun for about an hour now, and before we start the process of draining this water or this wort off into our boil kettle, we want to test and make sure that we've got full conversion of the sugars in the grains that have been transferred into our wort. So I'm going to use just a simple iodine tincture that you can pick up at the drugstore. I'll put a little bit of the mash wort into this white bowl, and we will add some iodine to it. If all the sugars have converted, the iodine won't change colors. And if they have not converted, then the iodine will turn black. So we'll know really quickly if we have full conversion. And we do. The iodine is kind of a goldish, bronzish color. And if we look at this, it stays gold or bronze. It doesn't turn black. So we know that we have full sugar conversion here. We can start the Vorloff process and start draining our grains. We want to open our valve, and we'll catch these first runnings into a pitcher to set the grain bed. We want to make sure that in that manifold the grain bed is set. We don't want any kind of this, we don't want any of the grain material into our boil kettle. So we may have to do this maybe 2 or 3 different times until we get a clear liquid that's running out of there without any grain material. We'll catch it in this, we'll recirculate it back to the top, and then we'll start allowing it to collect in our boil kettle. After we do this and we drain off the first runnings, we will batch sparge this particular recipe with 2 other rinsings of the grains called sparging. Rinsing the grains is a sparging process. And once we do that, we will have a full boil kettle of wort that we can boil and start adding the hops and flavoring. So just as an added measure of filtering, we've already completed our Vorloff. We have a clear wort that's coming out the grain bed's been set. But I like to use this hop strainer bag. I'll set it on and I'll just let the runnings run through that. So if any of the little particles do end up coming out of the tube at the bottom there, then it'll get caught in the hop grain bag and won't end up in our boil kettle. Just makes for a much cleaner wort. So we'll just open our valve slightly. We're going to let these first runnings collect really slow. We don't want to be too fast with this, or else we could end up with what's called a stuck sparge. That is, if you open the valve too much and you allow too much of the wort to come through the manifold, it can suck the grains into the manifold and clog the holes in the slots that are there, and it will prevent the liquid from flowing off. And if you get that, you'll have to open the valve and blow back through it with your mouth and blow those grains out of the manifold, and then start the Vorlofting process again to set the grain bed. So we want to try to keep from doing that. We only allow the valve to be open slightly, so we want to do this in a very, very slow process. Same thing after we add our sparge water. Once we have collected all of our first runnings, we'll add our sparge water. We'll Vorloft again. We've upset the grain bed just a little bit. We will set the grain bed, Vorloft, and repeat the process again for the second spars for the third runnings. So now that we have collected our first runnings in our boil kettle, we're going to start the sparging process. This rinses the excess sugars from the grains to make sure we get full sugar into our wort. So I'll have 170 degree water here. I'm just going to add back to the mash tun. And this is going to rinse these grains. We'll give this a stir to make sure that we get all the sugars into the liquid. Make sure all the grains get water contact again. Once again, we're going to have to worry about sanitation too much right now. All this is going to be boiled. We don't want to stir too much, but we want to make sure that all of the grains get water contact. We're going to repeat our vorlofting process. There's not as much water in the sparge as there was in the mash. Once again, we have this calculated to what our total wort volume is going to be. So in this particular batch, there was 2 1/4 gallons of water that went in there, and then we'll collect that. Some of that will be absorbed by the grains, and we'll collect that into our boil kettle in about 5 minutes. So we collected our runnings from our mash tun. So now we have a wort. Right now it has a really high sugar content in it. This particular recipe calls for a 60-minute boil of the wort. Once we bring this up to temperature, we will start adding our hops. This particular recipe calls for a bittering hop to be added at 60 minutes. So that will go in at the first of the countdown between 60 and 0 when we're done, flame off. So we'll add some hops at 60 minutes, and then again with 5 minutes left in the boil, we'll add hops, let those sit in there for 5 minutes. The first ounce of hops will give us our bittering to counteract the sugar that we have in our wort, and then the last will be flavoring hops to give us a little bit of a hop flavor. Just 2 hop additions on this particular batch, so it's a fairly high malt concentrated beer that we'll have for this particular one. But right now it'll sit on the burner, and once we bring it up to a boil, we'll start our clock at 60 minutes, add our hops, and then again at 5 minutes to go, and then we'll start the cooling process. Alright, so we have our wort boiling now. We brought it up to boiling temperature, so now we're on a 60-minute clock. For this particular recipe, it calls for a UK Target hop as our bittering hop. So we're going to add this at our 60-minute mark. We'll set our clock for 55 minutes. Then we'll add 1 more hop, let it boil for 5 minutes more, and that'll be our 60-minute boil. And then we'll start the cooling process with our immersion wort chiller and our pre-chillers. So right now we'll go ahead and add the UK Target hops. This will probably foam up a little bit. Didn't foam up a whole lot. Then we'll let that boil for another 55 minutes. So we've had our wort boiling for 55 minutes. Previously we added our Target hops, which were our bittering hops. We're going to go ahead and add our flavoring hops. These are UK Kent Golding hops. And we'll boil these for 5 more minutes, and then we'll start the cooling process to get our cold break and drop all the material down to the bottom of the boil kettle. So we'll put these in. That actually foams up a little bit. But those are our flavoring hops, so we'll set a timer for 5 minutes. We'll let those boil for 5 minutes, and then we'll be done. So now we're going to start the cold break process, where we actually cool the wort to drop all the proteins and the hop material to the bottom of our boil kettle. Once we're done with this process, we will actually siphon off the clean wort into our fermentation bucket. So the setup we have here today actually utilizes 2 immersion copper coils into ice water baths to help infuse a cold water into that boiling hot wort. We want to do this process as quickly as possible. The quicker we can do this, the quicker the material falls to to the bottom and the better utilization of that cold break that we're going to have. So we want to supercool the wort by running the supply water through these coolers with ice baths. We want to get that what was boiling wort down to 78 degrees as quick as possible, so we have the cold break. The cold break is dropping the proteins in from the grains and the hot material to the bottom. We will siphon that off into our fermentation bucket. Once we reach 78 degrees, that's the proper temperature to pitch yeast without damaging the yeast. We will be able to then shake that wort after we pitch the yeast to add oxygen to the bucket. At that point, we will set it up to sit for approximately 7 days to allow the yeast to eat off all the sugars that we boiled into the wort. That will in turn add alcohol to our beer, and we are much closer to having a final product at that point once we're done with the fermentation process. So we're cooling to the cold break, and hopefully this will take about 15 to 20 minutes to get to 78 degrees, and then we'll be ready to move it to our fermentation bucket and pitch our yeast. All right, so we have completed our chilling process. We've reached our cold break. Our wort is now down to 78 degrees. We are ready to transfer the wort to our fermentation bucket, where we will pitch the yeast and add oxygen, and that will in turn start the process of converting the sugars in the wort to alcohol, and eventually with our end product being our beer. So now that we have this, earlier in the process we talked about sterilization. At this point, this beer is susceptible to bacteria, so anything that touches this beer or this wort at this point has to be sterilized. Everything, any instrument that we use at this point, the fermentation bucket, the airlock, all has to be sterilized at this point. So we have a bucket of Star San here. You can see the foam. We have our test vessel here with our hygrometer. All of them have been in contact with the Star San. So the mantra with Star San is don't fear the foam. The foam doesn't hurt, or it doesn't affect the taste of the beer. It doesn't do anything. So we have our auto siphon. We will pull some wort out of the boil kettle into our auto siphon, and we'll put it into the vessel so we can test the original gravity of our beer. We can clip this onto the side so we hold it. Set this right here. Put this in. Our auto softener is working here. Just enough to fill that up. We can let that sit back inside. We pull this out. All these hoses have been in the Star San, so they're all sanitized. They can touch the beer at this point. So we removed some of our wort into our test vessel added our hygrometer. We're measuring the sugar content in our wort prior to adding yeast, so we'll know how much sugars or fermentables are available for the yeast to consume to convert to alcohol. In this particular case, with our batch today, we're somewhere around 1065, which is a fair amount of alcohol that we received out of our mash. So we can mark that down in our notebook, and once we know what our original gravity is, we'll measure this again after the yeast has done its job 7 days from now. We'll take another reading prior to bottling, and we'll know how much of that converted into sugar. We can convert that into an alcohol by volume for this particular batch of beer. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transfer the wort into our fermentation bucket. Once we get everything into the fermentation bucket, we'll move everything off of the boil kettle into our fermentation bucket. All of this has been sanitized and sterilized with the Star San. We'll put a lid on it. It'll be an airtight lid. We'll use our airlock. That will allow the CO2 to evaporate as the yeast consumes the sugars. It creates a CO2 gas. The airlock allows the gas to escape without allowing any kind of outside yeast, bacteria, or anything otherwise that would contaminate the beer to get into the bucket. So this lid will go on top of our fermentation bucket. We will add the yeast to the top, or pitch the yeast. We'll shake the bucket to add oxygen to allow the yeast to start the process, and then we'll put it in a closet and let it sit for about 7 days. So after we have pitched the yeast and shaked the bucket to add oxygen, we'll come back and check with our hygrometer what the actual final gravity is. That will give us our ABV calculation to determine how much alcohol we have in our beer. At that point, we'll be able to start the bottling process to move it into bottles, let it set for 2 weeks to bottle condition, and then we should be able to, after 2 weeks, open one up and see if it's ready to drink. After that, cheers, we have beer.
Alright, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to fill the airlock with vodka. With the airlock, what it's going to do is allow air to escape, but it won't allow any air to come in. And any air that does try to come in is going to be sanitized with the vodka.
And once again, we don't want anything that's going into the bucket to have any kind of bacteria or infection, so we dip our packs of dry yeast into the Star San. We use our scissors into the Star San. We will cut the tops of these packages of yeast off. Didn't quite get that one all the way cut off. There we go. We're going to take 2 packs of Safal S04, pitch onto the top of our wort, and this yeast is going to go to work creating or converting the sugars in the wort to alcohol. We'll seal our lid on here. I'm going to shake this first, and we'll add oxygen to it. After we've added oxygen to the beer at this point, anytime after this point, we don't want oxygen in the beer. It oxidizes our beer. So in the bottling process, we want to minimize oxygen. But right now we need oxygen for the yeast to be able to thrive and grow and do their job. So we'll shake the bucket for 1 minute. And once we're done with the shaking, we'll add the airlock with vodka. And it'll go sit in a closet at room temperature, preferably 74, 75 degrees. And it will sit for 7 days, and after that's done, we'll have beer.